Hi, this is Brian Kim. I'm going to share with you case number 204 in the Best Way to Do Cataract Surgery series. This is a dense cataract, and you're going to see terminal chop, cross chop, scissoring chop, mechanical fracturing techniques essentially to reduce CDE and, in my experience, clear corneas post-op day one. Again, you're leveraging mechanical forces using both instruments to fracture the lens into smaller pieces before trying to emulsify the lens pieces. If you have huge pieces that are very dense and use high ultrasonic energy, you can damage the corneal endothelial cells. And so this is my strategy and my recommendation to deal with the dense cataract. So you can see I'm using a cotton tip to try to steady the eye. This patient has a strong Bell's reflex. You can tell this is the right eye. I'm trying to turn the eye down, which is towards the right here. I use the cotton tip to steady the eye for the corneal mark, which will hopefully allow me to achieve a well-centered incised rhexis. I make a paracentesis incision first on the right side and then the left side. This patient, again, is squeezing, having some trouble. We put some more proparacaine on the eye to give the patient some more comfort. Using a dried cotton tip, I'm able to immobilize the eye for the left side incision. Using the cotton tip to hold the eye in that position, I quickly switch to the epinephrine. To help stabilize the pupil, and then switch to the dispersive viscoelastic cannula. And I'm holding the eye with the cannula for my triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel, and then I enter. Because this patient has a strong Bell's reflex, I'm going to keep that cannula there the whole time. And this is a puncture style rhexis. I'm going to puncture the center, pull down towards me, grabbing the tear, and then creating a flap using the corneal mark that I made previously to help guide the size and centration of the rhexis. And the nice thing about using the dispersive viscoelastic cannula is if I felt like the chamber was going to collapse, and if I have more OVD egress, I can push more viscoelastic with that cannula. Again, a smart way to deal with two things at once, the Bell's reflex as well as viscoelastic egress. And this is the Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place a cannula under the rhexis edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice wave, lift the lens up to decompress the bag, sweeping on the left side and then the right side, and the lens begins to spin. You can see the sharp shards of the lens. You can see the refractile nature of the central lens material, which tells you how dense this lens is. You can see there's a little bit of loose epithelium right over my para, and I will address that with a bandage lens at the end of the case. Removing the surface epinuclear material, switching to bevel up and starting in the dense mode, sculpting the lens. And again, you want to sculpt the lens. It just has to be as long as the diameter of the rhexis. You don't have to go too far out. Mainly, you want to debulk the central core and you want to go deep. But luckily, you don't have to go too deep as in the standard traditional stop and chop because you're not cracking from the top. If you did it that way and you didn't sculpt too deep, you would get the dreaded Pac-Man effect, which is the posterior plate phenomenon. Because I'm going to be performing terminal chop, I'm going to fracture from the peripheral side. And because you're able to get to the most posterior lens lamella from the equatorial side, because that's the most accessible part, by going out to the peripheral lens, the Capsulorhexis, the terminal side as they call it, I'm able to fracture the lens through and through. And because I'm fracturing from the terminal side and fracturing the most peripheral lens material by placing the chopper around the lens material, hooking the peripheral lens, I'm able to propagate that because of the nature of the lamellar fibers. Since they are concentric lamellar fibers, if I'm able to fracture through and through from the terminal side, I can follow that fracture point all the way through to the posterior aspect. You're able to avoid that dreaded posterior plate phenomenon. As you can see, I'm trying to spread and spread, You can see it's not getting the subincisional lens, so I'm turning it 180 degrees once more, and then I'm going to fracture the terminal side on the other side, and you're going to see a very effective fracture here. Go ahead and fracture that side as well. And now I have a through and through fracture point. But again, you can see how dense this lens is and those really stubborn lamellar fibers. You can see those stubborn lens fibers trying to keep the lens together. I place the chopper around the right heminucleus, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it centrally toward the phaco-tip and fracturing the lens in half, and that is a cross chop. Doing the same thing around that first quadrant, fracturing and separating the lens pieces, getting around the lens piece again with the chopper, fracturing it, and then performing a scissoring chop. Early here, I'm scissoring the posterior aspects of that piece, and this allows me to remove each fragment out, even though the posterior aspect is still interdigitated. And so that's why scissoring chop is really advantageous as well. If you have stubborn lens pieces that don't want to come out, you can at least debulk the lens by performing the scissoring chop maneuver and amputating those posterior adhesions. Placing the chopper around that second quadrant, fracturing it in half, getting around the lens with the chopper once more time, using some vacuum to lift it up, and then performing another scissoring chop maneuver, amputating the posterior adhesion and removing and debulking that lens piece. Using some vacuum to grab that piece up. Again, you can see how stubborn those lens pieces are. And that's because this is such a dense lens. Even though I'm performing cross chop, there is still some posterior adhesions of those fragments. Again, I'm able to bisect the lens completely with a terminal chop technique, but as far as fracturing the heminuclei, it's still quite a bit of a challenge, and that's why the scissoring chop is quite helpful. Turning off irrigation, and I'm going to go in with a dispersive viscoelastic cannula to coat the cornea some more. I turned the second heminucleus in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens, keeping that phaco-tip deep. By placing the phaco-tip deep, I have better leverage and opposing forces to fracture the lens completely in half. Go ahead and separate the third and fourth quadrants apart, placing the chopper around the third quadrant and performing another cross-chop maneuver, hooking the peripheral lens, and then fracturing the lens in half again. Again, these are challenging cases. You have no epinucleus protecting the posterior capsule with these lens cases, and so it's very important to leverage mechanical fracturing forces, and you're able to essentially fracture the lens, and at least with these fragments, I'm able to perform scissoring chop, debulking the lens anteriorly, removing those dense fragments little by little using mechanical fracturing forces and sparing amounts of ultrasonic energy. And once I've debulked it, I'm able to remove those posterior lens pieces, as you saw there. This is the last quadrant, placing the chopper around the lens. Because with these dense lenses, they're all interdigitated. And so being able to debulk the lens pieces and separating them from each other is really the key. And that's why terminal chop is so helpful, and that's why scissoring chop is also so helpful. Because even though I've performed the cross chop maneuver here, you can see how stubborn these posterior adhesions are. Placing the chopper around that fragment, crushing it with opposing forces once again. Again, I'm not using vacuum, so it's very safe to place that phaco-tip deep in the bag. But once I'm ready to actually emulsify the lens pieces, I'll make sure I'm protecting the posterior capsule, and then I start eating the pieces with the phaco-tip. So again, you want to think of cataract surgery now in dual modes. You know, the phaco tip is obviously going to emulsify the lens pieces and help you remove the lens pieces, but the phaco tip can also act like a second chopper. And so before you're ready to emulsify, you have to break the lens pieces into smaller pieces. Because if you try to emulsify and you have these giant pieces, guess what? The port will get covered and clogged, and then you're going to have wound burn if you're just trying to go metal to the metal and you just try to rely on the machine to break the lens piece. All you'll do is just kind of impale the lens and lollipop the lens, and it's going to be very inefficient, and you're going to damage a lot of endothelial cells. I've heard of people getting CDEs in the hundreds with these super dense lenses, and I just think that's not the best way to go. It's not efficient because you're relying on the machine to do the work for you. Why don't you break the lens pieces up into smaller pieces? And if they're all interdigitated, you can use a scissoring chop maneuver to amputate the posterior adhesions. Early on, you saw I did terminal chop. Yes, I did a little sculpting in the beginning, but you need that in order to debulk and create space, but also it allows you to, again, avoid that posterior plate phenomenon, which is really a non-starter in these tough cases. You need to be able to fracture through and through into bisecting the lens into two heminuclei, and then, again, executing the cross-chop maneuver and mechanical fracturing forces. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. Start subincisionally peeling the cortical material from anterior to posterior. You can see with these dense lenses, you're not going to have these large sheets of cortex coming out. You're just going to have just spotty areas of cortex. Go ahead and switch to polish mode, and going back and forth between polish mode and cortex mode to remove those segments of cortex. Always trying to go from anterior to posterior to get the cleanest removal. Yeah, just switching from polish mode and cortex mode allows you to basically go in with a low flow setting into the capsule fornix. And once you've grabbed the piece with vacuum, switch the cortex mode to increase the pulling force. You don't want to have high pulling force when you're going into the capsule fornix because you might grab the capsule and then rip the zonules. So I go in with polish mode with a low flow setting, grasping the cortical material, which is stuck to the bag, into the capsule fornix, and then switching to cortex mode to pull those pieces out. Pulsing BSS into the subincisional capsule fornix. You saw there was a big chunk that came out with that maneuver, and that's why I love doing that maneuver. It gives me a lot of confidence. I'm actually effectively cleaning the subincisional capsule fornix. Switching to cohesive viscoelastic to fill the bag. I'm going to go ahead and polish with the sweep, first on the left side and then the right side. I'm using the cannula to hold the eye while I'm sweeping because this patient has that Bell's reflex. When I sweep on the right side, I have the incision going through the incision on the left side, so I have more control with that side. I sense this patient had some weak zonules as well during the cortex removal, and so I go ahead and decide to place a CTR. So you can see the CTR is on the platform. That you see that long groove there. I like to place the eyelet right over that groove and then approach the left side eyelet parallel with the injector and then hooking it and then withdrawing it into the injector. And so that's my way of placing the CTR through the injector. And then using the Lester, I'm going to grasp the leading eyelet as it comes out. This reduces torsional stress on the bag, and then I pop it into the bag. With these super dense lenses, they tend to have weak zonules. So again, I put a CTR in this case. And then also I like to put in a 3-piece lens in these dense lenses. So I'm widening the incision. I'm switching to the cohesive viscoelastic cannula because as I push the injector into the incision, it can cause OVD egress. And then I push viscoelastic to fill the bag at the same time. Making sure the leading haptic goes into the bag, making sure the optic comes out flat, and the trailing haptic is pointed to the right. Dialing the trailing haptic into the bag with the Maltzman. Irrigating the surface of the eye. Going in with irrigation off, activating irrigation, removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag, polishing under the rhexis edge, removing all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incisions. So again, when you're dealing with these super dense lenses, you want to debulk. And in order to debulk, you have to remove the central core somehow, some way. And everyone has their different techniques. Sculpting is the most efficient way to do that, especially since you have maximum corneal endothelial protection because you just put the OVD in the eye. You can go ahead and sculpt and know with confidence that you're protecting the cornea. The problem is when you start to do these techniques and you're using a lot of vacuum to remove the lens pieces, invariably you're going to remove the OVD that's coating the cornea, and that's when you get a lot of that damage. And so early on when you sculpt, the risk of corneal endothelial trauma is very low. But if you continue to use a lot of vacuum throughout the case, you're going to remove OVD, and you'll have to use a lot of dispersive viscoelastic, stop and put dispersive viscoelastic throughout the entire case, which is not efficient, and it also makes you question, maybe I shouldn't be using high vacuum because I'm not only removing lens pieces, I'm also unintentionally removing the viscoelastic. And so that's why using mechanical forces is so much more efficient. You're using sparing amounts of ultrasonic energy in vacuum. By using less ultrasonic energy in vacuum, you're going to have less endothelial trauma, clearer corneas postoperatively. And also, because you're not using as much vacuum, you're most likely not going to be inadvertently removing the viscoelastic that's coating the cornea, which is supposed to be protecting you from endothelial trauma. And so again, using opposing forces to crush the lens into smaller pieces, using terminal chop to effectively avoid a posterior plate phenomenon, and then scissoring chop when you actually have some posterior adhesions. You can amputate those posterior adhesions using the scissoring chop maneuver, turning the chopper sideways. And once you've removed and debulked the anterior lens pieces, you can go after the posterior lens pieces very easily and perform that on the first heminucleus and then second. And this is very easy, systematic, very controlled way to disassemble the lens in the context of a ultraluminescent cataract. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.